So today's speaker is Jessica Burke. Jessica began her career in an environmental and food testing laboratory. Following that, she held various roles in quality assurance and food safety in the food manufacturing industry, where she helped multiple companies strengthen their food safety systems and achieve GFSI certification. Jessica has held multiple roles within BRCGS, including technical specialist for the gluten-free certification program and plant-based global standard, and senior technical manager for the Americas region. In her current position as delivery partner relationship manager, her role is to support BRCGS delivery partners in delivering world-class service through collaboration, facilitation, and technical education. We will have some time at the end for questions, and everyone will remain muted. So when you have questions, and we encourage them, please submit them through the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen. And now I will pass things over to you, Jessica.
Thank you so much, Pam. Thank you for that introduction. What I really wanted to do today was just take you through the key changes of food safety issue 8 to issue 9, so that you know sort of what the main topics are that you should be focusing on before your next audit. So to sort of give you an idea of where we are now in terms of the standard. And so this is issue 8 stats, obviously, but basically we've got over 22,000 certified sites. We've got a 5.3% year-over-year growth. We operate in 126 countries around the world. And the top country is Italy, and then that's followed by the UK, and then China is in third place. And we work with over 74 approved certification bodies around the world. And our certification bodies are obviously really important to us because they're the ones that go out and actually deliver the audit and make sure that the standard is being met in your facilities. So that is where we're at. So just to give you a bit of an overview of the timeline, and obviously some of these activities have taken place already, but so the standard was published in August of 2022, just this past August. Then the auditor ATP training rather began in September. And once the ATPs are trained, those are our approved training partners. At that point, then our auditors and sites training begins. And so that will begin in October. So if you are interested in, getting a more of an in-depth view of what the changes are, then I definitely recommend doing that. And then audits begin February 1st of 2023. And I do want to just mention that this is a firm cutoff date, which means that if you have your audit on January 31st, it will be to issue 8. And if you have it on February 1st, it will be to issue 9. So as you can imagine, a lot goes into the development of our standards, and it actually starts as soon as the previous standard launches, because we look at any information that has been collected throughout the life of the standard. We obviously receive a great deal of feedback through things like email inquiries. Our certification bodies are always coming to us with feedback because obviously they're kind of our front line. So they come back to us with all kinds of information and feedback. And then we have a formal public consultation on the draft standard. All of this feedback is then shared with the BRCGS standards team and the technical working group, which consists of international stakeholders, food manufacturers, retailers, food service companies, certification bodies, and some independent technical experts. So the focus of attention for this rewrite has been encouraging a better understanding and further development of product safety culture. Obviously, I'm sure it's clear to everybody that culture is it's really important, and it's getting more and more attention every day. So we made sure to really focus on this in issue 9. Ensuring the global applicability and alignment with the revised version of Codex Principles of Food Hygiene, which was released in 2020. And then, of course, to ensure alignment with the GFSI initiative. We've also expanded audit options to include ICT, which is information communication technology. We learned a great deal about the use of ICT throughout the pandemic, and we've taken these learnings and incorporated them directly into the standard. And then another key theme is the enhancement of core product safety activities. So talking about things like internal audits and root cause analysis. And then lastly, we have provided greater clarity for sites completing animal primary conversion and producing animal feed. So another thing that we always look at when we are in the process of rewriting a standard is trends related to our top nonconformities. So these are the top nonconformities for issue 8. And we collect a lot of data around these nonconformities as well. And what we've noticed is that there's a repeat trend of many of the same nonconformities year over year. And when we look at the associated corrective actions and preventive action plans that are submitted with these nonconformities, we really have to start asking ourselves how many of these would still occur if the fundamentals of product safety were enhanced. So the next question is then, what are the fundamental key concepts that would lead to stronger food safety management systems? The ones that issue 8 focuses on are internal audits, root cause analysis, validation and verification, risk assessment, incident management, and traceability. And although issue 8 did cover these concepts, issue 9 goes into a lot more detail, and the ambiguity has been removed. This will basically enable sites to enhance their basic fundamental controls, and hopefully this will mean a reduction in the frequency of these basic nonconformities that we're seeing. So this is a really high level overview of the changes, the key changes to the requirements from issue 8 to 9. And in summary, they cover product safety culture, HACCP, outsourced processing, root cause analysis, food defense, equipment, and animal primary conversion. But don't worry, we're going to go over all of these in a little bit more detail over the course of the presentation. As I mentioned earlier, we've also made changes to the protocol with the addition of blended audits and mandatory 1 and 3 unannounced audits. Now, these are not necessarily new concepts, and the options are already available. We introduced them during COVID, actually, and these are documented in position statements. However, we've basically just incorporated them right into the standard at this point. So let's get into the key changes of the requirements themselves. So the first one is on food safety and quality culture. Food safety and quality culture has been a theme of many presentations over the years, and we did decide to include it within issue 8. That's when it was first introduced into the standard, because we know that the culture within a company strongly impacts the ability to maintain and improve food safety and quality processes. And in fact, the root causes of many nonconformities across various versions of the standard actually demonstrates that a proactive and positive product safety culture within a company can really make all the difference in terms of effectiveness of the food safety and quality plan and its consistent implementation throughout the site. So the clause doesn't prescribe the exact mechanisms that must be used. And the reason for this is to allow the site some flexibility to develop the systems that are effective for their specific ways of working and the current culture prevailing within the site, because everybody's probably going to be starting at a little bit of a different place. It does, however, highlight the minimum scope of the plan. So if we look at the exact clause itself, it is structured very similar to issue 8. However, what you'll see is that we've defined some of the activities that must be included in your food safety culture plan. One of the things that we had identified, within the issue 9 working group, is the influence of behaviors on culture. And for this reason, behaviors is now included right in the clause. And these relevant behaviors might be identified by a manager's or supervisor's knowledge of the site, or throughout a site survey or artifacts of the behaviors or beliefs or attitudes that exist at the site. However, we still do want to be very clear, just like within issue 8, we're not expecting the auditors to be auditing the food safety culture itself. Rather, they're going to be looking at the detail of the plan itself and how the activities were identified, how they were developed and measured, and a review of the effectiveness of the completed activities, as well as the actions taken based on the results of the measurements. And then, of course, a review of the plan itself. The second key change that has been made is to section 2, which is the HACCP or food safety plan section. The clauses in section 2 have been updated to reflect the latest Codex HACCP principles. Now, this shouldn't be a major change for sites that already have a robust system in place, and most of the changes to Codex were already part of section 2. One thing we do want to highlight that we receive a lot of questions about is around terminology used in certain regions of the world. So sometimes sites think that they need to have a different plan and a different word for the plan, depending on what region of the world that they're in or who their customers are. So we would actually advise that you avoid trying to have multiple plans with different terminology. Alternative terminology is obviously acceptable by the standard, provided that the requirements have been fully met. So, multiple plans are okay if you feel that that's necessary for your own operational requirements, but it's certainly not a requirement of the standard. So basically, we don't care what you call your plan as long as it's meeting all of the requirements of the standard. That's the main thing. And then one other thing to mention here is that we have changed terminology. So you'll see that we've changed the term sanitizing to disinfection. So you'll see that heavily throughout section 2 as well. So to go into a bit more detail behind one of the key changes made to section 2, and probably the biggest one as a result of Codex, is so Codex has published extensive guidance on the validation of food safety controls. And based on this, Food 9 includes a new requirement on validating HACCP or food safety plans prior to any changes which might affect product safety. And this is to ensure that the plan will effectively control the hazards before implementation. Now, much of this is already part of issue 8. However, issue 9 is definitely a little bit more prescriptive about the need to validate and document prior to the implementation of any changes that would affect food safety. And so when we talk about validation here, what we're talking about in this context could be a range of activities, including literature review, validation studies, guidance received from local authorities, or legislation. Again, the key is that the site must have some sort of mechanism to capture and review each and every change. If sites already have effective HACCP plans in place, validation can be achieved using the processes that have been developed in accordance with clause 212.2 and 212.3 of issue 9. So moving on to outsourced processing, it has undergone a bit of a revamp. This is an area that has caused quite a bit of confusion in the previous versions of the standard. And although we did update this in in issue 8, the feedback was that it's still an area that is quite unclear and required some further updating for clarity. Obviously, this is a vital process that can have a huge impact on your product safety processes. So we've updated the section quite significantly, specifically around the definition. We've also updated the statement of intent, and there are now new requirements that have been built in to ensure that any risks that are associated with the process are included in the site's HACCP plan, and that there is clear visibility and an agreed specification with the outsourced processing supplier to ensure that there are no risks to your products. So this slide provides an overview of the basic definition of outsourced processing. So it's basically when an intermediate step such as production, processing, packing, or storage is completed at another company or site. So basically what would happen is that raw materials would be received at your site. Some of the processing steps would then be completed at your site. And then that product or partially processed product would go out to another site for part of the process, and then it comes back again to your site, where it would then undergo a further step, which could include further processing, packing, or storage. So all of this, this situation would be considered outsourced processing. So what would not be considered outsourced processing? If your materials receive an additional storage or processing step prior to first even arriving at your facility, this is not considered outsourced processing, and this would be managed by the site using the supplier approval mechanisms and raw material risk assessments and specifications that you would normally use. And then if the entire process is completed off-site, that would also be outside of the scope and would be considered contract packing and would need to be controlled under the management of services. And then just another kind of way of looking at it, and also to clarify with traded product, the difference between traded product and outsourced process. So, you know, like I said, with outsourced processing, we're talking about an intermediate step where the product begins and ends at your facility and something is happening in between. If the site, however, purchases a product, stores it, and then intends on selling it, that is not considered outsourced processing. That would be considered a traded good. So basically, for traded goods to be applicable, and how it's different is that with the traded goods, you're purchasing with the intention to sell. You're not doing anything to the actual product itself. Whereas with an outsourced process, it's an intermediate step that's completed off-site, and the process comes back before distribution. Now, another key area that we have updated is root cause analysis. And although issue 9 has not introduced any majorly new themes, there is a big focus on the evolution of the existing core product safety practices, and root cause analysis being one of those. These are the practices that we believe that when are strengthened will lead to things like improved food safety practices, decreased complaints, improved culture at the site level. And then in addition, it may also lead to a decrease in those repeat nonconformities that we talked about at the beginning of the presentation. So just to give you some context, the top 10 nonconformities account for just 5.6% of the clauses in the standard, but they actually account for 30% of all NCs that are raised. So root cause analysis is one of these core product safety concepts as a result that we felt needed to really be enhanced and should be considered an important tool to prevent reoccurrence. So while a number of clauses in the standard specifically require root cause analysis, so we reviewed all of those clauses to ensure that we had a consistent approach throughout the standard and a better linkage to other sections for continual improvement. However, I will say that it's still important and up to the site to establish a procedure for their completion of root cause analysis. And basically that just needs to include a set of parameters that will initiate the use of the appropriate tool, whichever that may be. And we'll talk about a couple of those in a moment. Who's trained or authorized to complete the analysis, the methods that the site will use to conduct the analysis, the records which detail the analysis and any subsequent preventive actions, and the methods for verification of the completed actions. The auditor will be expecting to see a documented procedure that includes this information, as well as any evidence of any root cause analysis and preventive actions that the site has carried out. So this is one of my favorite slides, and I think we're all familiar with this approach to problem solving. It's all about blame and hiding issues and looking the other way and firefighting. Obviously, an approach like this one isn't going to address the root cause of any issue or prevent any reoccurrence. We have come a long way, but unfortunately, this type of approach can often still be seen in industry. Probably, I would say, especially in sites that have a little bit less mature food safety management systems. So root cause analysis basically is designed to introduce a logical problem solving process. So it's looking for the process or system that failed or allowed the nonconformity to occur. So it's not about playing the blame game. We're not looking for who, but what. And while it's always tempting to assume that we know what happened, any hypothesis should be tested for accuracy rather than assumed. So basically, don't jump to conclusions without the supporting facts. It's also important to note that root cause analysis is a different process from incident management and immediate corrective action. Although these activities are often completed in close proximity, but they do need to be considered as separate processes to avoid confusion. Basically, the overarching aim is to introduce action which eliminates the cause and prevents reoccurrence rather. So there are a few different techniques and tools that you can use to complete your root cause analysis. And it's definitely not a one-size-fits-all situation. The tool that you're going to use will depend on the complexity of the issue, and you may even want to use a combination of tools in some cases. So this one's the 5 whys technique, and it's the simplest method and a question asking method used to explore the cause and effect relationship underlying the problem. So basically, the investigator keeps asking the question why until a meaningful conclusion is reached. Although the method does suggest a minimum of 5 questions being asked, it is important to just continue asking those additional questions until the real cause is identified, rather than drawing a partial conclusion, which will lead to reoccurrence. And then another tool is the fishbone, whose name comes from the form the diagram takes as it's constructed. And this is most useful when the 5 whys tool is a little bit too basic. So for example, where a complex issue needs to be considered in more bite-sized pieces, or where there's a lot of data that needs to be trended. And one of the key aspects of this type of root cause analysis is to visually lay out the causes of the problem. So it basically works by breaking down the various aspects of the problem to allow the investigator to consider one section at a time and to visualize the relevant information. So another key change is to food defense. So basically, we have put more of an emphasis on food defense by actually taking it and separating it out from site security and mirroring the food fraud section. This essentially encourages sites to adopt those rigorous food defense systems and enable sites to choose whether they want to consider the two topics of food fraud and food defense together or separately. Despite this new emphasis, the changes to the requirements themselves are not very dramatic. And if you do have an existing system in place that meets the requirements of issue 8, then you shouldn't have anything to worry about. And most of the requirements for issue 9 will be met. And then section 4.6, so equipment. So this has actually undergone a bit of a revamp. And this is because the topic of equipment hygiene and its suitability for use in food manufacturing, which is commonly referred to as hygienic design, has developed quite a bit since the publication of issue 8. So basically, we've updated this section to reflect current best practices in the industry and to make sure that it's in line with legislative requirements that have been recently updated. So there's a number of examples there that I can think of. So EN, if you're familiar, EN 162/2009 is for food processing machinery. ISO 14159/2002 is safety and hygienic design of machinery. And then actually GFSI has issued a new benchmark, which is around building and equipment manufacturers and building and equipment users. So basically, most of the learnings from these documents have been taken into consideration in issue 9. And then just to go into a little bit more detail there, because I know that that's something that is probably going to be a bit of a change. So 4.6.1 has been updated. So basically, before any new equipment is purchased, a purchase specification needs to be agreed by the site to ensure that the new equipment will meet any of the relevant legislation and be suitable for food contact where appropriate, as well as suitable for the intended use. And then I just wanted to stress there as well that new equipment in this context also includes equipment that's been purchased from another manufacturer, refurbished, and secondhand equipment. So it could be new to site equipment. And then 4.6.2 has been updated to include more detail. So we're saying that the design and construction of equipment must consider product contamination. So for example, it must be designed to prevent product contamination. And those examples are things like making sure that there's correct seals there, impervious surfaces, smooth welds and joints, and all of that kind of stuff. And then 4.6.3 requires a documented risk-based commissioning procedure to ensure food safety and integrity is maintained during the installation of new equipment to the site. And in addition, a hygiene clearance procedure, as well as an inspection before being accepted into operation will be necessary. And then 4.6.4 is new, and this is a procedure for managing the movement of static equipment in production areas to ensure that food safety is managed and integrity of equipment is maintained. And what we're talking about here is equipment that isn't necessarily meant to be moved on a regular basis. It could be part of a line, for example, that you're moving from one area to another. And because it's rarely moved, it's more likely that unintentional introduction of a product safety risk or damage to the equipment could be caused without consideration of those things. And then 4.6.5 is new. This is a new clause to ensure that the cleanliness of the equipment and the condition of the equipment is managed after it's been stored and prior to use, to ensure things like dust, dirt, and other contaminants are removed. And then 4.6.6, so there's always a risk of inadvertently moving contaminants from one area to another when mobile equipment is used. So we're talking about things like forklifts and pallet trucks. And so this clause was added to ensure that sites consider and manage this risk as well. And then lastly, 467 is new, and this is battery charging equipment, and just saying that it's not to be stored in open product areas or where there's risk to products. Then animal primary conversion. So this is a new section, although the requirements are not all necessarily new, but what we've done is put the requirements sort of neatly into one section to make it easier for sites and auditors to identify all of the clauses related to this process. So for issue 8, this information was contained in a separate position statement to reflect the GFSI, and that's now just been incorporated directly into the standard. So a couple things to highlight here. Some countries have specific legislative requirements around prohibited substances. So we're talking about things like vet medications and stuff like that. This is now considered as a clause within the section, and sites are expected to operate a system that complies with those legislative requirements. Traceability is obviously important for food safety and legality requirements for all food safety products. And this includes all edible parts of the carcass as well. So sites must have systems in place to meet this. And lastly, sites need to confirm post-slaughter times and temperatures to ensure product safety as well. So again, these aren't necessarily new. They were already within a position statement. We're just putting them directly into the standard now. So we do have a key changes document that I wanted to highlight. And the key changes document is really, really useful. It basically lays out issue 8, takes issue 8 and adds the changes to issue 9 in red. It's almost like a track change document. So you can see exactly what the change was from issue 8 to issue 9. So it's really, really helpful to go through that as you're preparing for your next audit. We also, it's not on this slide, but we also have an interpretation guide, which is extremely helpful. I can't rave about that one enough. It goes through every one of the requirements, and it just adds detail around what the requirement actually means, what the expectation is of the requirement, and in some cases, examples of what could be used in order to meet that requirement, and what the auditor might be looking for. So I would definitely recommend downloading those 2 documents if you haven't already. So then moving on to the key changes to the protocol itself. Again, no majorly new changes here, but what we have done is we have put what has already been outlined in position statements throughout the life of the standard from issue 8. We've just incorporated them directly into the standard, into issue 9. So the first update is on the 1 in 3 unannounced audit program. I will say that this has caused a little bit of fear, maybe is the right word, in the industry. So, just wanting to make sure that everybody is aware that it is a GFSI requirement. So all of us CPOs, whether it be BRCGS or SQF or FSSE, are required to have this in our standards. And so basically what it means is that for all certified sites, they need to have at least 1 unannounced audit every 3 years. And the reason why this was added is because it's kind of one of those things that adds an extra level of confidence to customers for their suppliers. The voluntary unannounced audit was introduced many years ago in the UK by the BRCGS standard, and it's actually used quite a bit over in the UK, and it's just kind of the culture over there. And what we have found is that unannounced audits actually go a really long way in terms of improving the culture of a site, because it's kind of that always audit ready mentality. So, you know, what I would say about if you are feeling a little bit fearful of having these unannounced audits, please don't. It's just an audit. If you already have good systems in place, there's nothing to worry about. The auditor is going to be looking at exactly the same things as they always do. I personally, in my life before BRCGS, went through unannounced audits, and of course, you know, the first time it came around, I was nervous, but it was totally fine. So please try not to be scared. Is what I'm trying to get at. We do understand that there are some challenging situations for unannounced audits. In particular, thinking about seasonal sites, and you know, we've got some really remote Alaskan fisheries, for example, where the site has to be contacted because there's no place for the auditor to stay, and maybe they have to get to that location by boat, so they need to be able to contact the site in order to even get to the site. And so we have taken some of those challenging situations into consideration, and we have a supplementary document, which is BRCGS 079, which kind of addresses these situations. So they will be sort of like a case-by-case basis, where you would discuss it with your certification body, and then they would come to us and we would figure out a solution for that, because there are going to be challenging situations for sure. And then the next thing around protocol is the introduction of blended audits. So this is basically a two-part audit, where the first part of the audit is completed remotely, and then that's followed by an on-site audit within 28 days later. This option rather, was actually introduced during COVID. I think that it was going to be introduced regardless. It was already in process, but it was something that we needed to introduce more quickly because we needed to offer solutions to the industry, which would make it a little bit easier to obtain an audit. So basically, this is already in a position statement, and we've added it to the standard itself. It is GFSI recognized. That has been a question. And I think the reason why there's been a bit of confusion about that is because a fully remote audit, so meaning the whole entire thing, including facilities inspection and that kind of stuff, is done remotely in a fully remote audit. That is not recognized by GFSI, and that will eventually go away. That was only introduced during COVID, and again, it was only so that customers could have some sort of indication of that the food safety requirements were still being met. But the blended audit, where there is still that additional on-site piece, which is really important in terms of touring the facility and observing that all of the GMPs are being followed and the facilities are in good order, is definitely recognized by GFSI. And then this is just basically a simple overview of the audit options that are available. So as a reminder, the announced option now includes the mandatory unannounced audit every 3 years, meaning that sites with annual audits will have at least every third audit as unannounced. Sites that are C or D grade will be expected to undertake an unannounced audit every 3 years, but they will have more announced audits in the interim. So there's been a question about that, about whether a site with a C or D who's maybe on like a 6 month frequency, whether they might be having more unannounced audits. The answer is no, it's still just one every 3 years. It's not one every cycle. And then, of course, the blended audits we talked about. And then we still have our voluntary unannounced audit option available to sites, which is basically every year you have an unannounced audit. That one is voluntary. And then this is a list of the publications for 2022. So of course, the standard and translations, as well as the interpretation guide and key changes, have already been published. Those were published at the beginning of September. And then some of the additional modules have been published already as well. So we've got a global gap additional module, meat supply chain, as well as the FSMA additional module. And then we have a number of guidelines which help in different aspects of the industry, depending on what specific industry you're in. So we have a fresh produce guideline, raw meat, raw poultry, air quality, product changeover, and we're planning on developing a bunch more in 2023 as well, in order to kind of go one step beyond the interpretation guide to kind of hone in on very specific issues within the industry. So that is it for my slides. The one thing I will stop sharing screen, but the one thing before we get to questions is I did just want to touch on, Pam had asked me to touch on the difference between or similarities between risk assessment versus risk-based in the standard. So, we say the term risk-based quite often. So, and then we also say has to be a documented risk assessment. And so what I would say is that if something says risk-based, I'm just trying to think of an example. So internal audits, for example, they need to have a schedule which is based on risk, or a risk-based schedule. So it's not going to be quite as complex as a process as a documented risk assessment, but the auditor is still going to be looking at how a documentation to say, how did you decide the frequency on each of these things? So what made you think that, for example, preventative maintenance, what made you think that needs to be done on this frequency versus another frequency? And so you need to sort of be able to justify that. So if in the standard it says something needs to be risk-based, that is going to involve doing a risk-based or a risk assessment and having that behind it. So I know I didn't cover that in my presentation, but I wanted to make sure that I did talk about that as well.